Mormonism's Book of Abraham, Hieroglyphic Hoax or Inspired Translation. This is an updated presentation from Watchman Fellowship's original Witnessing to Mormons with the Book of Abraham. You can download a free PDF presentation guide using this QR code. A caution from 1 Peter 3:15. At the outset, we want to caution you not to utilize the information presented in this series to attack, bash, or belittle Latter-day Saint friends and neighbors. Imagine yourself being accosted by an antagonistic atheist who belittles and ridicules both you and the Bible. The information contained in this series can be devastating to a Latter-day Saint. Upon hearing this information for the first time, many Latter-day Saints will go through denial, disillusionment, and experience a gamut of conflicting emotions. Consider this information as pointing out a thread in someone's tie. You simply point out the thread and let them do the unraveling. At our office in Arlington, we have a dinner once a month for what we call Mormons in Transition. And this is for anyone who has come out or is presently coming out of the Latter-day Saint Church. And we have dinner, and we sit around and we listen to each other's stories. And one reoccurring theme in these dinners repeatedly throughout this past year has been how everyone has discovered the single thread, and once they started pulling, things just began to unravel. And one of the many problems that continually comes up, one of the many big threads that people start to unravel, are the many problems that they begin to see with the Book of Abraham. So the controversy. The controversy over the Book of Abraham is a complex issue that goes back to the mid-19th century, with much scholarly debate and details involved in Egyptology, LDS doctrines, church politics, and church history, all of which often center upon the means by which Joseph Smith allegedly translated the Book of Abraham. If Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham is shown to be in error, then what are the implications for how he translated the Book of Mormon? And what then are the implications for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and those who believe their sacred scriptures to be true? The official LDS position on the Book of Abraham. The essay about the Book of Abraham found on the LDS website, churchofjesuschrist.org, concludes that, quote, "The veracity and value of the Book of Abraham cannot be settled by scholarly debate concerning the book's translation and historicity. The book's status as Scripture lies in the eternal truths it teaches and the powerful spirit it conveys. The Book of Abraham imparts profound truths about the nature of God, His relationship to us as His children, and the purpose of this mortal life. The truth of the Book of Abraham is ultimately found through careful study of its teachings, sincere prayer, and the confirmation of the Spirit." End quote. But this brings us to a perennial problem with presenting incriminating information to Latter-day Saints about their history, doctrines, or practices. Smith is the only one to whom God gave this special revelation. The LDS will often refer to their own personal feelings and testimony, and the LDS Church believes that one can understand the deeper truths about the Book of Abraham by spiritual means, even though the text of the papyri has nothing whatsoever to do with Smith's English translation. As former LDS, now evangelical Christian Corey Miller notes, a significant problem for most Latter-day Saints is that, quote, "subjective personal testimony is taken as a sole criterion for truth," end quote. Miller goes on to note that, quote, "the passage Mormons rely on is Moroni 10:4, which states, 'And when ye shall receive these things, I would exhort you that ye would ask God, the eternal Father, in the name of Christ, if these things are not true. And if you shall ask with a sincere heart, with real intent, having faith in Christ, He will manifest the truth of it unto you by the power of the Holy Ghost." End quote. But the second largest Latter-day Saint group, the Reformed Latter-day Saint Church, rejects the Book of Abraham as being authentic. There is a warning label right on the front of the Book of Mormon. Another testament of Jesus Christ. But note what the Apostle Paul says in the book of Galatians, chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. Quote, I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is not just another account, but there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, even now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. Emphasis added. So here are the Mormon scriptures. They consist of the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the King James versions. The Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and what we're going to talk about today is found in the book The Pearl of Great Price. The Book of Abraham was first published in 1842 and was canonized as part of the Pearl of Great Price in 1880. In the Pearl of Great Price, you'll find the Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith's version of Matthew, Joseph Smith's history, and the Articles of Faith. And we'll get into this in more detail, but this is a picture of Facsimile No. 1 from the Book of Abraham. This is an actual papyri that Joseph Smith is believed to have used when he translated the Book of Abraham. It appears in woodcut form, actually in the Book of Abraham and the Pearl of Great Price. And we'll see more about this in detail as the lecture goes on. But note for the moment these drawings. It is believed that Smith or someone close to him filled in the missing torn pieces of papyri. This is significant, as we'll soon see. So how did the Book of Abraham come to be? How did it all get started? Well, a traveling display of authentic Egyptian artifacts were being shown throughout the U.S. in the early 1830s. These artifacts included a few mummies as well as some papyri. The show made a stop in Kirtland, Ohio, where Smith and the newly formed Mormon Church were headquartered. Joseph Smith writes, "The public mind has been excited of late by reports which have been circulated concerning certain Egyptian mummies and ancient records, which were purchased by certain gentlemen of Kirtland last July." This can be found in the History of the Church, Volume 2, on page 348. Smith continues, "The records of Abraham and Joseph, found with the mummies, is beautifully written on papyrus. The records were obtained from one of the catacombs of Egypt by the celebrated French traveler Antonio Cebolo. We now know that Smith was in error about Antonio's last name. It is not Cebolo, but Lebolo, in the year 1831. But on his way from Alexandria to Paris, he put in at Trieste, and after 10 days' illness expired. That is, Lebolo had died. But then a gentleman named Michael Chandler discovered there was something with the mummies. So on the 3rd of July, 1835, Michael H. Chandler came to Kirtland to exhibit some Egyptian mummies, the ones obtained from Lebolo. There were 4 human figures, together with some 2 or more rolls of papyrus, covered with hieroglyphic figures and devices. As Mr. Chandler had been told, I could translate them. He brought me some of the characters, and I gave him the interpretation, and like a gentleman, he gave me the following certificate. So this is what Michael H. Chandler said of Joseph Smith after he read Smith's translation of the hieroglyphics. Quote, "This is to make known to all who may be desirous concerning the knowledge of Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr., in deciphering the ancient Egyptian. I find that of Mr. Joseph Smith, Jr. to correspond in the most minute matters." End quote. But there was a problem with Smith's translation from the beginning. For historical context, in the 1830s, there wasn't anyone who could fluently read or transcribe Egyptian hieroglyphics. It was considered by professional Egyptologists and scholars to be a dead language at the time of Smith. Smith goes on in History of the Church, Volume 2. You can find this on page 236. Soon after this, some of the saints at Kirtland purchased the mummies and papyrus. I commenced the translation and found that one of the rolls contained the writings of Abraham and another the writings of Joseph. But in 1835, when no one had fully deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics, how could Chandler possibly have known that Smith's translations were even remotely accurate? Smith encouraged the church to come up with a significant amount of money to purchase the scrolls, along with a few other artifacts. According to an October 2014 article in the Salt Lake City Messenger, published by Sandra Tanner and Utah Lighthouse Ministries, Smith paid Chandler $2,400 for the scrolls, a mummy or two, and sundry other artifacts, equivalent to $70,000 or $80,000 today. The Rosetta Stone. Discovered in July 1799 by a soldier in Napoleon's army stationed in Egypt. The Rosetta Stone contained hieroglyphs, Demotic, and Greek languages, the Demotic being a translation in Egyptian of the hieroglyphs. The inscriptions, apparently composed by the priests of Memphis, summarize the benefactions conferred by Ptolemy V Epiphanes, 205 to 180 BCE, and were written in the 9th year of his reign in commemoration of his ascension to the throne. And this comes from Britannica.com under the topic of Rosetta Stone. Milton R. Hunter, a late LDS general authority, commenting on the Pearl of Great Price in 1948, writes this, quote, "The knowledge of Greek had never been lost to mankind, but hundreds of years had passed since there was even one man left in the entire world who could read hieroglyphic or demotic symbols." The scholars readily deciphered the Greek on the Rosetta Stone and guessed correctly that the two other sections of writing contained the same information. They would henceforth have a key to the Egyptian language. Just how much help could Joseph Smith have received from all the scholars of the world if he had solicited their assistance in deciphering the Nephite writings, that is, the golden plates and the alleged reformed Egyptian in which they were written? Practically none. Champollion, the scholar that was working on the Rosetta Stone, was virtually the only one who knew anything in particular regarding the Egyptian characters, and he was in the very midst of his work. So Joseph Smith knew nothing of the Rosetta Stone or Champollion's work. Bill McKeever and Eric Johnson have noted in their book, Mormonism 101, examining the religion of the Latter-day Saints, quote, "The LDS Church acknowledges that Joseph Smith claimed no expertise in any language. The Lord did not require Joseph Smith to have knowledge of Egyptian. As with the Book of Mormon, the papyri were allegedly translated by the gift and power of God. Joseph Smith did not claim to know the ancient languages of the records he was translating." End quote. These quotes from the LDS Church within McKeever and Johnson's book can be found on the churchofjesuschrist.org website. See the section Translation and History of the Book of Abraham. From a non-Mormon website, ldsdiscussions.com, they note, quote, "None of the characters on the papyrus fragments mentioned Abraham's name or any of the events recorded in the Book of Abraham. Mormon and non-Mormon Egyptologists agree that the characters on the fragments do not match the translation given in the Book of Abraham, though there is not unanimity, even among non-Mormon scholars, about the proper interpretation of the vignettes on these fragments. Scholars have identified the papyrus fragments as parts of standard funerary texts that were deposited with mummified bodies. These fragments date to between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, long after Abraham lived." End quote. So here is what is known as Facsimile No. 1. This is a reverse image of the wood carving image that appears in the Pearl of Great Price with the Book of Abraham. Notice the head here and the arms here. Remember, in the beginning, we noted that those were hand-drawn in between the torn pieces of the papyri. These were believed to be added by Smith or someone close to him. Here they are again. So here are some of the fictions that Smith purported to be truth in Facsimile No. 1. Here is No. 1 in the facsimile. Notice it's a bird. Joseph Smith says this is the angel of the Lord. No, Egyptologists now know it's a representation of a human soul ready to return to Isis. It should not be a bird's head either, but a human head. Note here number 2. Smith claims this is Abraham fastened to an altar. It is not. It is an Egyptian priest, the deceased. And notice here number 3. Smith says this is an idolatrous priest of Elkanah. No, again, it is the Egyptian god Anubis, whose head was that of a jackal, not a human being. Remember, that's the head that Smith, or someone close to him, had sketched in the missing piece on the papyri. Here is the introduction to the Book of Abraham. Quote, "A translation of some ancient records that have fallen into our hands from the catacombs of Egypt. The writings of Abraham, while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his own hand upon papyrus." Recall what we just saw a second ago. The papyri are dated long after Abraham's time. Here is facsimile number 2, also pictured in the Book of Abraham. No known original papyri exist for this image. We will talk more about this in detail in just a minute. And this is facsimile number 3, also featured in the Book of Abraham. Also, no known original papyri exists for this as well, and we will get into the details of this in just a minute. Not like an Egyptian. Mournful news for Mormons in the New York Times. This is a headline from the New York Times, Sunday, December 29th, 1912. Note what it says. Museum walls proclaim fraud of Mormon prophet. Sacred books claimed to have been given divinely to the first prophet are shown to be taken from old Egyptian originals, their translation being a work of the imagination. So the treasures that are mentioned in the article are these stone jars from Egyptian tombs. Just take a careful look at their heads there. They are funerary jars, not Smith's fabricated idolatrous gods. Let's have a closer look. So here is facsimile number 1, and you'll notice under the altar, those stone jars, well, there they are from the Metropolitan Museum. Quote, "The 4 canopic jars carried the heads of the 4 sons of Horus, the Amenti, spirits of the underworld. After embalming, the viscera were placed in their respective jars. Imset received the liver, Quibisenuif the intestines, jackal-headed Dimuatef the stomach, and Happy received the lungs." Circa 550 BC from the British Museum in London. But the kinds of decorative canopic jars found in Smith's papyri, the ones decorated with the heads of Horus's sons, came centuries after Abraham's time. Most scholars put Abraham's exodus from Ur of the Chaldeans early in the 2nd millennium BC. According to the Bible, Abraham lived 175 years. See Genesis 25, 7 through 8, which would have put his death before the canopic jars with the heads of Horus' sons were in use in Egypt. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica website, the earliest canopic jars, which came into use during the Old Kingdom, 2575 to 2130 BCE, had plain lids, but during the Middle Kingdom, 1938 to 1630 BCE, the jars were decorated with sculpted human heads. From the 19th dynasty until the end of the New Kingdom, 1539 to 1075 BCE, the heads represented the 4 sons of the god Horus: the jackal-headed Duamutef, the falcon-headed Quibisenuif, the human-headed Imset, and the baboon-headed Happy. So here is a comparison chart using Smith's names and the actual Egyptian names for these funerary jars. What Smith calls Elkanah is actually Quibisenuif, the falcon. What Smith calls Libna is actually the jackal-headed Duamutef. What Smith calls Mamakra is actually Happy, the baboon. And what Smith calls Korash is actually Imset, with a human head. Facsimile number 2, a hypocephalus. A hypocephalus is, quote, "a circular sheet of papyrus containing extracts from the 162nd chapter of the Book of the Dead, stiffened with plastered linen and placed as an amulet under the head of an ancient Egyptian mummy in the coffin. That is a Merriam-Webster.com dictionary definition of hypocephalus. Now, I want to point out this section down here, something that Smith labels as figure number 7. I'm going to invert it here, and you'll see it is someone or something sitting on a throne. Here's what Smith thinks this is. Quote, "Perhaps the most troubling aspect of this facsimile, however, is Joseph Smith interpreting figure 7 as, quote, God sitting on his throne, revealing through the heavens the grand keywords of the priesthood," end quote, when in reality it is the Egyptian god Min with an erect penis. And we know that the church is aware of this issue, as they temporarily censored the erect penis in editions of the Pearl of Great Price, end quote. And note here the middle section in yellow, what is figure number 1? Smith claims figure number 1 to be signifying the, quote, first creation, end quote, which is, quote, near the celestial or the residence of God, end quote. It is supposedly a star, the star, known as Kolob, closest to God's throne or dwelling place. Many today in the Mormon Church believe this star to be Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. Egyptologists now know figure 1 is the four-headed Egyptian ram god Khnummu. Facsimile number 2, the polytheism of Mormonism. If you could hie to Kolob in the twinkling of an eye, and then continue onward with that same speed to fly, do you think that you could ever, through all eternity, find out the generation where gods began to be? So begins the opening stanza of an LDS hymn written by W. Phelps, one of Joseph Smith's assistants who helped Smith translate the Egyptian papyri. The Deseret News first published the hymn in 1856. When in Utah in July of 2022 for our annual Watchman Fellowship outreach to Latter-day Saints, I actually attended an LDS chapel service, and I heard the congregation sing this hymn. Now, Kolob and this hymn and this papyri, they're all significant and tied together here in the Book of Abraham, chapter 4, verses 3 through 5b. Note what it says. I think you'll find this to be somewhat familiar. Quote, "And they, the gods," that's in the actual book, that is not my parenthetical insertion, "said, Let there be light. And there was light. And they, the gods, comprehended the light, for it was bright. And they divided the light, or caused it to be divided, from the darkness. And the gods called the light day, and the darkness they called night." End quote. Now, this is exactly one kind of example of what the Apostle Paul was speaking about in our opening verse regarding the Galatian church. This is a different gospel. It is also a fabricated or made-up cosmology. As Dan Vogel has observed in his book, Book of Abraham Apologetics, a Review and Critique, quote, "Abraham's scheme, according to Smith, was both unique and consistent with what was understood and believed by astronomers and natural theologians in the mid-19th century. The mix of contemporary astronomy and theological concerns resulted in a cosmology that is as foreign to 21st century readers of Smith's text as ancient Hebrew cosmology was to Smith and his contemporaries." End quote. That brings us to facsimile number 3. Smith says figure 2 is King Pharaoh. Not only is it not a pharaoh, it's not even masculine. It is the goddess Isis, wife of Osiris. She is identified by the cow horns and the solar disk between the horns. These facsimiles, again, are reprinted in the Book of Abraham as woodcuts. You can see them. If you get the Pearl of Great Price, this picture will be in there. Smith says figure 1 is Abraham. It's not Abraham at all. It's Osiris, god of the underworld, husband of Isis, who is standing behind him. There's a picture of Osiris. You can see how well it matches the papyri there. Smith didn't know any of this. So you have Isis misidentified, and you have Osiris misidentified by Smith. We're going to talk about here figure number 5. Smith says figure 5 is Shulam, a waiter. It is not. It is Hor, the deceased, who is being introduced to Isis, Osiris, and figure 4. Who is figure 4? Right there. Smith claims figure 4 is a prince of Pharaoh. Wrong again. Once more, Smith misidentifies gender. Figure 4 is Mot, mistress of the gods. Not at all like an Egyptian. From New York, more mournful news for Mormons. In 1967, the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art presents the Latter-day Saint Church with original Smith papyri used in the translation of the Book of Abraham. People believed that these papyri were lost in the Chicago fire of 1871. There is a handwritten letter that accompanies these papyri from Smith's widow Emma, dated May 26, 1856, authenticating the papyri as belonging to Smith. The late LDS scholar Dr. Hugh Nibley, to whom the church turned for helping interpret the newly rediscovered papyri in 1968, said of Facsimile 3, quote, "If Pharaoh and the Prince of Pharaoh in Facsimile 3 were being drawn to order, why on earth were they not drawn as princes, or at least men, instead of being so very obviously women? Is this cunning alteration to suit Smith's interpretation?" This quote comes from Gerald and Sandra Tanner's monumental work, Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, and it can be found on page 353. An Egyptian alphabet and grammar? Included in the documents that were given to the church by the museum were handwritten documents believed to be Smith's, which included hieroglyphs in the margin, followed by paragraph descriptions of what each character meant. So back to facsimile number 1 for just a second. In the upper left-hand corner of the papyri, you'll see some Egyptian characters. Here is the documents that were presented along with this papyri, and you'll note a striking similarity. Let's magnify this a little bit, and here is one hieroglyph, and that is up here, and you notice the paragraph next to it in Smith's handwriting. Here is another character right there, more descriptions from Smith. Another character right here, more descriptions from Smith, and yet another character right here. So look at the details that Smith provides for each one of these characters. Just keep that in mind. Let's just take this character as an example. There you see the character followed by Smith's writing. Just look at how much detail he gives to this one symbol. Here's what Smith says it means. Quote, "It was made after the form of a bedstead, such as was had among the Chaldeans, and it stood before the gods of Elkenner, Libnah, Mamacra, and also a god like unto that Pharaoh, king of Egypt. That you may have an understanding of these gods, I have given you the fashion of them in the figures at the beginning, which manner of figures is called by the Egyptians Chaldeans Ralinos." End quote. But in reality, what do Egyptologists know the symbol now means? It's simply a symbol for pool or water. You can see page 21 in your guide for more symbol comparisons. New meanings of translator and translation. Quote, "Joseph's study of the papyri may have led to a revelation about key events and teachings in the life of Abraham, much as he had earlier received a revelation about the life of Moses while studying the Bible. This view assumes a broader definition of the words translator and translation. According to this view, Joseph's translation was not a literal rendering of the papyri, as a conventional translation would be. Rather, the physical artifacts provided an occasion for meditation, reflection, and revelation. They catalyzed a process whereby God gave to Joseph Smith a revelation about the life of Abraham, even if that revelation did not directly correlate to the characters on the papyri." End quote. My emphasis is added. You can find this quote at thechurchofjesuschrist.org under Study, History, Topics, Book of Abraham Translation. Back to facsimile number 1. July 1835, History of the Church, Volume 2, Smith says, quote, "The remainder of this month I was continually engaged in translating an alphabet to the Book of Abraham and arranging a grammar of the Egyptian language as practiced by the ancients." End quote. Emphasis added. Smith here, in his own words, claims his translation of ancient Egyptian language was precisely how the Egyptians used their language. He was not claiming that it was some unique or hidden spiritual translation about Abraham's life unknown to the Egyptians. So what does the papyri text here actually say? Scholars believe it's something like this. Osiris shall be conveyed into the great pool of Khons, and likewise Osiris Hor, justified, born to Techebet, justified after his arms have been placed on his heart, and the breathing permit, which Isis made and has writing on its inside and outside, has been wrapped in royal linen and placed under his left arm near his heart, and the rest of his mummy bandages should be wrapped over it. The man for whom this book has been copied will breathe forever as the boss or the soul of the gods do. Again, as we noted earlier, this is believed to be common Egyptian funerary papyri. So that's what scholars believe this actually says, nothing even remotely close to what Smith translated. The Rosetta Stone and Egyptology of the late 19th century. By the late 1800s, Jean-François Champollion's translation work on the Rosetta Stone had become widely known and accepted by scholars all over the world. Egyptologists in the United States and abroad could now easily identify and translate Smith's papyri and facsimiles. In 1912, an Episcopal bishop in the Salt Lake City area, Reverend F.S. Spalding, published a pamphlet titled Joseph Smith, Jr. as translator. Spalding showed some of the facsimiles to Egyptologists of his day, asking scholars if Smith's translations were accurate. And as Gerald and Sandra Tanner point out in Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, Dr. Arthur C. Mace, who was at the time of Spalding's pamphlet and the 1912 Times article cited earlier in our presentation, the assistant curator, Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in the Department of Egyptian Art, stated, quote, I return herewith, under separate cover, the pearl of great price. The Book of Abraham, it is hardly necessary to say, is a pure fabrication. Joseph Smith's interpretation of these cuts is a farrago of nonsense from beginning to end. Egyptian characters can now be read almost as easily as Greek, and 5-minute study in an Egyptian gallery of any museum should be enough to convince any educated man of the clumsiness of the imposture. End quote. Additional problems with the Book of Abraham and Latter-day Saint responses to the Book of Abraham criticisms. At the beginning, we talked about what was Mormon scripture, and in the Pearl of Great Price, remember, we'll find these books, the Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith's version of Matthew, Joseph Smith's history, and articles of faith. This is important because within the Pearl of Great Price, you will find the roots of racism within Mormonism. The curse of dark skin is found in the Pearl of Great Price. Here are some specific scriptures. Quote, there was a blackness came upon all the children of Canaan, that they were despised among all people. That comes from the Book of Moses, chapter 7, verse 8. Also from the Book of Moses, chapter 7, verse 21, quote, they were a mixture of all the seed of Adam, save it was the seed of Cain, for the seed of Cain were black, and had not place among them, end quote. And this is continued in the Book of Abraham with these references, quote, and thus from Ham sprang that race which preserved the curse in the land, that curse being the curse of dark skin. And again in the Book of Abraham, chapter 1, verse 27, quote, now Pharaoh, being of that lineage by which he could not have the right of the priesthood, notwithstanding the pharaohs would fain claim it from Noah through Ham. Therefore my father was led away by their idolatry. And Pharaoh coming from that line of dark skin. Word. So what this means in very practical terms is from the mid-1800s all the way until 1978, blacks were prohibited from taking the Mormon priesthood. Now, some Mormon apologists will point out that there have been a handful of African Americans who have had the priesthood, but they are trying to paint a picture that was much better than it really was. But it was in 1978 that the LDS leadership believed that they received a new revelation from God that allowed blacks to finally have the priesthood. This is from the Brigham Young University newspaper, The Daily Universe, a headline from 1978, announcing this prophetic change. What does the LDS Church today say about racism and the priesthood? Quote, "Today, the Church disavows the theories advanced in the past that black skin is a sign of divine disfavor or curse, or that it reflects unrighteous actions in a premortal life, that mixed-race marriages are a sin, or that blacks or of people of any other race or ethnicity are inferior in any way to anyone else. Church leaders today unequivocally condemn all racism, past and present, in any form." End quote. But there is no mention of the curse verses from the Book of Moses or the Book of Abraham in this official LDS Church essay. You can read the full essay here at this QR code. So here are a few common responses from LDS officials and apologists regarding criticism toward the Book of Abraham. One is called the long-lost scroll defense, and it is a defense where LDS scholars and apologists claim that the Book of Abraham comes from non-extant papyri. That is, the actual text of the Book of Abraham, the papyri, is no longer available to us. It's long missing. Here's what they say. This is from the official LDS website. Quote, "It is likely futile to assess Joseph's ability to translate papyri when we now have only a fraction of the papyri he had in his possession. Eyewitnesses spoke of a long roll or multiple rolls of papyrus. Since only fragments survive, it is likely that much of the papyri accessible to Joseph when he translated the Book of Abraham is not among these fragments. The loss of a significant portion of the papyri means the relationship of the papyri to the published text cannot be settled conclusively by reference to the papyri." End quote. And that comes from the official LDS Church website and their essay in the Gospel Topics. But just recall previously how Smith erroneously translated one Egyptian symbol for pool or pool of water. So the missing scrolls don't help Smith. Given the information we do have about the inaccuracy of Smith's translation abilities on the surviving fragments, that even if missing scrolls were found, we have sufficient evidence to conclude Smith would have been in error about those scrolls as well. Another response is called the catalyst theory. LDS scholars and apologists claim that the Book of Abraham is still somehow inspirational, and we touched on this quote earlier in our presentation. Quote, "Alternatively, Joseph's study of the papyri may have led to a revelation about key events and teachings in the life of Abraham, much as he had earlier received a revelation about the life of Moses while studying the Bible. This view assumes a broader definition of the words translator and translation. According to this view, Joseph's translation was not a literal rendering of the papyri, as a conventional translation would be. Rather, the physical artifacts provided an occasion for meditation, reflection, and revelation. They catalyzed a process whereby God gave to Joseph Smith a revelation about the life of Abraham, even if that revelation did not directly correlate to the characters on the papyri." And that is the catalyst theory that you sometimes hear in defense of the Book of Abraham. Essentially what that says is that the Book of Abraham, though Smith got the interpretation completely wrong, is still a catalyst for meditation and further spiritual reflection. But I want to also point out that the authors of that essay on the LDS website attempt to argue that translation means something more than typically what we think of when we think of the word translation. But I want to use Smith's own words about translation in regards to the Book of Mormon. Here's what Smith says in History of the Church, Volume 1 on page 71. He says this, quote, "I wish to mention here that the title page of the Book of Mormon is a literal translation taken from the very last leaf on the left-hand side of the collection or Book of Plates, which contain the record which has been translated, the language of the whole running the same as all the Hebrew writing in general, and that said title page is not by any means a modern composition, either of mine or of any other man who has lived or does live in this generation. Therefore, in order to correct an error which generally exists concerning it, I give below that part of the title page of the English version of the Book of Mormon, which is a genuine and literal translation of the title page of the original Book of Mormon, as recorded on the plates." End quote. So Smith here, in regards to the Book of Mormon, thinks he's translating it literally as what the language appears on the plates. And so we can infer that Smith was doing that with the Book of Abraham, as we noted in one of his quotes earlier. He said he was translating as the ancient Egyptians would have understood it. This past summer, I attended a Latter-day Saint chapel service in Weatherford, Texas, near where I live, including their Sunday school that followed the main service. I had a wonderful conversation with a gentleman who was very nice, who told me he was a lawyer, he was a father, he had a wife and a couple of children, and he told me in our discussion after church that his faith in Mormonism was just a feeling. We exchanged cards, and I sent him an email and thanked him for his discussion, but he did not want to get into the details of what the Mormon scriptures said. For him, it was just a feeling. All of this research that I have conducted in talking to Mormons, going to Utah twice last year, speaking with Mormons, attending their services, reading their scriptures, understanding the problems with the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham, has reminded me of the importance of 2 Timothy 2:15, where Paul tells Timothy, quote, "Be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a worker who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth." End quote. So it is important to give a defense for the hope that is in us with reverence and gentleness, but also knowledge, knowing that we have the truth and that we have good reasons for believing the truth. And so if we just rely upon feelings, we are finally no different than a Latter-day Saint who does exactly the same. But with Christianity, there is a great deal more evidence, both textually and historically, great differences between the revelations that have been given to the men in Scripture versus revelations that have come privately through Joseph Smith. So this presentation just touches the surface of all the issues involved with the Book of Abraham, and I hope it can provide you with some knowledge and ability to share with your Mormon friends and neighbors, something that might lead to further fruitful discussions.
The fact that the church allows Book of Abraham apologetics, that it has allowed it to exist knowingly, and that it allows it to continue, violates the church's own standards of honesty in a way that for me is egregious. For me, Book of Abraham was the catalyst to my faith crisis. Before the Book of Abraham, I did not believe there was a smoking gun. I'm 30, I'm 31. It's the Book of Abraham that led me down the rabbit hole into the full faith crisis. And it's because the church is knowingly deceiving people, in my opinion.
Brigham Young taught that there were certain sins you could commit that the blood of Christ wouldn't cover, and your own blood would be required. But he says, let me suppose a case. Suppose I found my brother in bed with my wife. I would immediately put a javelin through them both, and this would give them exaltation and forgiveness, and I would have done a righteous thing to help them in moving forward to get forgiveness. And then he goes on to say that there are certain sins that you can commit that the blood of Christ won't cover. Your own blood will be required. And as I read this sermon, it just knocked the props out from underneath me. Early Mormonism, Brigham taught for years that Adam is our father and our God, and that Jehovah was a God above Adam, and above Jehovah was Elohim, and above Elohim was a whole bunch of other gods. And that was nothing they talked about in church, about Adam-God doctrine. The Book of Mormon says that we're saved by grace after all we can do, and it took a while for that to sink in. That was adding works as a part of our salvation.
On July 24th, 1847, 148 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints arrived in the Great Salt Lake Valley after a daunting 1,300-mile westward trek from Nauvoo, Illinois.
The Mormons today don't really study or know what Brigham Young taught, so they wouldn't recognize this as a part of early Mormonism. And in the temple ritual for years, they pantomimed the taking of life for revealing the secrets of Mormonism or for apostasy. And up until 1990, in their temple ritual, they were swearing an oath of obedience to never tell any of these things or to fight against the work of God, which to them meant Mormonism. And so they pantomimed putting the thumb to the throat and pulling it quickly across their throat as one of the signs in which life could be taken. And in the original temple ritual, it was very clear that you were swearing an oath that if you revealed the temple ritual or sinned against the prophet or fought against the truth, that you forfeited your life.
Latter-day Saints will tell you that they believe Jesus is the Savior, but according to LDS doctrine, we must earn or work toward our salvation.
Racism in Mormonism was there right at the beginning. Even when Joseph writes the Book of Mormon, he has the American Indians being described as dark and loathsome because they're supposedly rebellious people that came to America in 600 BC were Israelites. And the bad guys got turned black and the good guys were white. So even in the Book of Mormon today, there's a racial concept. Now that was about the American Indian, why they're dark. But then as the Mormons move down into southern states, they start developing more of a idea of priesthood and color and race. The Mormons like to point to that early period as better than I think it really was, because they want to point to a couple of African men that were given priesthood. But what Mormons don't realize is they were an anomaly that was stopped under Brigham Young after they came out west. Blacks were not ordained to the priesthood for decades, and they were not allowed to go to the temple. They weren't allowed to get married in the temple. It didn't just affect men. African women were not allowed to go through the temple or anything for decades. But then in 78, they announced that God has now declared all people of all races to be equal and all can go through the temple.